Last time we spoke about Francis Garnier and his wild expedition in Vietnam. Yes, against all his superiors' orders, Garnier decided to grab a few of the boys and sail upriver to threaten and steal territories for France. He first struck the grand city of Hanoi, taking it much to the shock of the Nguyen officials. But he did not stop there, oh no. He then set his eyes upon the provinces of Phu Nhuyen and Phu Li. Both were taken with shockingly small forces, but Garnier strived for even more and dispatched forces to take Hai Dung. Then he found out the Vietnamese at Ninh Binh were forming an army to fight him, so he attacked. This greatly pissed off the Vietnamese and their Black Flag Army allies who attacked Hanoi, and in the process Garnier died, charging into the enemy like a madman. Today we are going to continue the story of how France colonized Indochina. This episode is the Tonkin Campaign. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have a multi-part series on Asia during World War I. And one of those episodes is on how French Indochina helped the Entente powers. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Last month's exclusive podcast over there was on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. Last time we spoke, Henri Rivière basically took up the mantle of Francis Garnier and began to seize territory in Tonkin, against his nation's wishes. That was, of course, until the government changed, and the new administration led by Jules Ferry were much more pro-colonization, and immediately supported Rivière. Now, Rivière's actions had caused a real maelstrom for the Nguyen Empire. Leo Yong Fu went to Hanoi and slapped a note against the citadel on March the 26th of 1883, threatening to kill Henri Rivière, taunting the French into battle. This scared the hell out of the Nguyen court, who expected Rivière to unleash hell, so they ordered Prince Hoang Ke Vinh to go seek out the Black Flag Army to see what could be done. Hoang Ke Vinh was sent under the guise he was trying to move the Black Flag forces away from Hanoi, but Rivière did not buy that at all. Rivière sent a letter to Hanoi's military commander, Hoang Zhao, demanding he submit or get rid of the Black Flags. Otherwise, he would yet again attack Hanoi. Hoang Zhao simply stated it was impossible for him to do so. Thus, Rivière and his forces occupied Hanoi by April the 26th, further stressing out the Nguyen court, who desperately sent envoys to negotiate with France. Meanwhile, Hoang Ke Vinh saw the paint on the wall and began to mobilize forces in northern provinces for war. During the negotiations with the French, Rivière demanded the French be allowed to garrison at Saint-Thé, but the Nguyen court said they could not. It was in fact because the Black Flags were there. Rivière took this as an act of hostility, and he began to suspect Hoang Ke Vinh was working directly with the Black Flags. Things were, however, not looking good for Rivière. He had a very limited force and was forced to go on the defensive. The Nguyen court then ordered Hoang Ke Vinh to write a letter to the French in Hanoi to officially explain the role of the Black Flags, in a vain hope of regaining Hanoi free of conflict. Despite all of this, Hoang Ke Vinh and the Black Flags were still mobilizing for battle. On March the 28th, in response to Leo Yong Fu's taunting, Rivière elected to go out and fight the enemy. Why would he do this, basically with just 500 men against thousands? Well, according to the French, Rivière was forced to do so to protect the prestige of France. So he led a column of 450 troops out of Hanoi Citadel to face a Black Flag army who had taken a position in Phi Hai, just a few miles away. His force was soon discovered by Leo Yong Fu's scouts, who set up an ambush at a village called Gaozai. Within this village was a bridge known to the French as Pont de Papier, paper bridge. The Black Flag forces hid themselves west of the bridge in the village of Chongtang, Tiantang, and Haiyanke. These three smaller villages were covered in thick bamboo grooves and trees, making them excellent spots to perform an ambush. The French column reached the paper bridge around 7:30 a.m., led at the front by Chef de Bataillon Berthe de Villers. As they crossed the bridge, the French vanguard was suddenly fired upon by Black Flag troops, prompting Berthe de Villers to deploy his men into a line formation and push them forward towards the three villages. Leo Yong Fu waited for the enemy line to fully commit, then he tossed in reserves, launching a sudden flank attack against the French's right. The Black Flag flanks volleys caused tremendous casualties upon the French, mortally wounding Berthe de Villers, forcing Rivière to assume direct command of the column. To avoid encirclement, Rivière ordered his men to pull back and regroup on the other side of the paper bridge. The retreat was conducted initially in good order, being covered by artillery support, but then disaster struck. Suddenly, their artillery cannons overturned by the force of their own recoil fire, prompting Rivière and some officers to rush forward to try and help the gunners, allowing the Black Flag to unleash some deadly volleys. The volleys killed some French officers and wounded Rivière, and upon seeing this, the Black Flag soldiers surged forward to attack the French rearguard. During the mayhem, Rivière was killed, and almost a complete catastrophe occurred for the French forces. That was, of course, until Lieutenant de Vaisseau Picel took command and pulled the men to the eastern side of the bridge. The Black Flags were finally pushed back, and the French column was forced to limp back to Hanoi. The French had lost 5 officers, 30 men, and had 55 wounded. It is estimated the Black Flag had lost 50 dead, and perhaps 50 wounded out of a total of 1,500 men. In the greater scheme of things, it was a small battle, but it had a significant effect. Aside from the loss of face for France and the death of Rivière, it prompted action from the new government of France. Jules Ferry's administration received word of the loss of Rivière on May the 26th, and it was met with outrage. French Naval Minister Admiral Corb declared, "France will avenge her glorious children." His words would be echoed in the Chamber of Deputies, for they immediately tossed 3.5 million francs to finance the punitive expedition to Tonkin. The Tonkin Expeditionary Corps were established in June of 1883, sent primarily to pacify Tonkin. They were led by Général de Brigade Alexandre Eugène Buet, the most senior Marine infantry officer close at hand, that being in Cochin, China. Buet began his new mission by changing the attire of his forces, introducing lightweight black pajama-style summer uniforms, with some added black cloth to cover their white pith helmets. The idea behind this was, well, simple. Try not to stand out like a sore thumb so much in the jungle. Buet arrived to Tonkin to find their position pretty precarious. The French only had small garrisons in Hanoi, Nam Di, Haiphong, and the very isolated small outer posts in Hon Gai and Quy Nhon. Thus, for the month of June, he had the men dig in and perform defensive actions, sporadically being harassed by Vietnamese and Black Flag forces. Buet needed to wait for reinforcements, and he decided to hire some local yellow flags. I never really talked about them too much, but the yellow flags were basically the same type of force as the Black Flags, Chinese bandits who crossed over the border after the Taiping Rebellion. The Vietnamese government initially began to support the yellow flags to fight off the Black Flags, but as time went on, the Black Flags pretty much beat the shit out of the yellow flags. Excuse my French. Buet would allegedly hire 800 yellow flag members to augment his own forces. In late July, Buet received reinforcements when Admiral Corb arrived to Ha Long Bay, giving the French around 2,500 infantry, 6 gunboats, and some artillery pieces to work with. Buet knew that these forces could perform some offensive campaigns against the Black Flag Army, but he also was under orders to push for a political settlement with the Nguyen Empire to recognize the French protectorate in Tonkin. Fuhuai as a first action. They also noted that Rivier's suspicions about the Nguyen court working with the Black Flags covertly was most likely true. Therefore, they decided to also strike against the Vietnamese forces as well. This was a significant escalation, as attacking the Nguyen army forces could provoke the Ching dynasty. The first thing to be done was to sail up the Hui River, but in order to do so, the French would need to seize the Thuan An fort guarding its entrance. Admiral Corb took his flagship Buet out on August the 16th to scout the forts while his flotilla assembled. Corb would have the ironclad Bayard and Atalante, the cruiser Chateau Renaud, and the gunboats Viper, Lynx, and the armed transport Drac and Animite. On August the 18th, the flotilla got into position at the entrance of the Hui River. A delegation was sent in advance to the Nguyen officials to demand the surrender of the forts, but the fort's commander declined to respond. At 5:40 p.m., the French ships began to open fire, met by return fire from the forts. The bombardment lasted only an hour until it got dark, and the ships had to turn on their electric searchlights to illuminate the forts. Dawn the next day, the ships recommenced bombardment, devastating the forts, though the Nguyen forces did return fire and managed to hit their ships a few times. On August the 20th, 2 marine companies were landed near the northern fort, led by Captain Parillon of the ship Bayard. The Vietnamese trench-line troops fired upon the invaders. After an hour of fighting, Parillon seized the northern fort and raised the French flag over it. After taking this fort, the French turned their attention to the southern fort and began to bombard it, and they prepared Marines to land. It was all for nothing, however, as the defenders had abandoned the fort and the nearby village while the northern fort was under attack. The casualties for the Nguyen forces were quite heavy, with some outrageous estimates ranging up to 2,000. And I'll just say it right here and now. Much like my series on the First Opium War, the estimates are primarily coming from primary sources who happen to be French, and I will tell you they are simply lies. It is not feasible that a few hundred men in some of these battles kills thousands upon thousands of men. They are simple exaggerations to make the French look good. So take everything with a grain of salt, and I think I came up with a rule in my head once. Divide everything by 3 when it comes to the French estimates on the Vietnamese or Chinese casualties. Enseigne du vaisseau, Louis-Marie Julien Viau served under Admiral Corb aboard the Atalante, and he wrote extensively of the Tonkin Campaign under the pen name Pierre Loti. He wrote about the Battle of Thuan An, giving accounts of the atrocities committed by the French forces. He would later be recalled by the French Navy and suspended from duty for publishing such works. Here is a passage about the aftermath of the battle. The great slaughter now began. Our men fired double volleys, and it was a pleasure to see their streams of well-aimed bullets shredding the enemy ranks, surely and methodically, twice a minute, on the word of command. We could see some men, quite out of their senses, standing up, seized with a dizzy desire to run. They zigzagged, swerving this way and that way, as they tried to outrun death, clutching their garments around their waists in a comical way. Afterwards, we amused ourselves by counting the dead. Pierre Loti spoke of how the French Marines took pleasure bayoneting wounded Vietnamese troops, slaughtering the clearly outgunned men. The seizure of the forts shocked the Nguyen court, and after a 48-hour armistice was quickly agreed upon, the Nguyen court agreed immediately to evacuate 12 inland forts defending the Hui River, destroying their ammunition and removing barrages. Jules Hamel sailed up the Hui River to meet directly with the Nguyen court, where he threatened them with complete annihilation unless they accepted a French protectorate over both Tonkin and Annam. This is what he said to them. If we wanted to, we could destroy your dynasty root and branch and seize for ourselves the entire kingdom, as we have done in Cochin, China. You know very well this would present no difficulty to our armies. For a moment, you hope to find help from a great empire on your borders, which has on several occasions posed as your suzerain. But even if such a suzerainty ever existed, and whatever the consequences that might once have resulted from it, it is now nothing but a historical curiosity. Now here is a fact which is quite certain. You are completely at our mercy. We have the power to seize and destroy your capital and starve you all to death. It is up to you to choose between war and peace. We do not wish to conquer you, but you must accept our protectorate. For your people, it is a guarantee of peace and prosperity. For your government and your court, it is the only chance for survival. We give you 48 hours to accept or reject, in their entirety, and without discussion, the terms which we are magnanimously offering you. We believe that there is nothing in them dishonorable to you, and if they are carried out with sincerity, on both sides they will bring happiness to the people of Annam. But if you reject them, you can expect to suffer the most terrible of misfortunes. The worst catastrophe you are capable of imagining will fall far short of what will actually befall you. The Empire of Annam, its royal dynasty, and its princes and court will have voted for their own extinction. The very name of Vietnam will be erased from history. And all I have to say to that passage is, holy shit. The Nguyen court cowed to this on August 25th by signing the Treaty of Hue. The treaty forced the Nguyen Empire to recognize the French protectorate for both Tonkin and Annam. The Nguyen court would survive, but now it had to take direction from French advisors. The Nguyen emperor would be required to take a personal audience with the French Commissioner General in Tonkin, an unprecedented thing for them. And in return for all of this, the French would drive out the black flags, something they were already doing. Now, while Admiral Corb slammed the Nguyen forces at Tainan, General Buet led the offensive against Leo Yong Fu's Black Flag Army. He led 2,500 French and Vietnamese troops, augmented by a further 450 Yellow Flag members. His force was divided into 3 columns. The left column, led by Lieutenant Colonel Leo Yong, consisting of Marines, Cochin Chinese riflemen, 2 artillery sections, and a Yellow Flag battalion. The central column, led by Chef du Bataillon, Paul Corona, consisting of a Marine battalion, a Marine artillery battery, and some Cochin Chinese riflemen. And the right column was led by Colonel Bichot, consisting of a Marine infantry battalion, an artillery battery, and more Cochin Chinese riflemen. Bichot took his column along the Red River, where 6 French gunboats could support his movements. Buet took a reserve force and marched behind Leo Yong's column as they went to Phu Huai. Leo Yong Fu's Black Flag Army consisted of around 3,000 men, and he had them take a position using 2 lines of field fortifications blocking the roads going to San Tai. The first line was near the village of Cao Zai, where Riviere had died on the paper bridge, and the second line was close behind it, defending the approach to the villages of Phu Noi, Nai, and Hung. As Riviere's left column tried to attack the right side of the Black Flag's first line, they were quickly counterattacked by Leo Yong Fu, who was leading the bulk of his forces. Riviere's men began to run low on ammunition and performed a fighting withdrawal towards the paper bridge. As they did so, their Vietnamese coolies began to panic, nearly causing a rout. However, a Marine infantry battalion took up a position in the village of Vam and provided cover fire for the withdrawing forces, inflicting heavy casualties upon the Black Flag Army units, who had left their defensive line to pursue them out in the open field. As the night was approaching, Buet tossed his reserves in, enabling Riviere to stabilize the line. During the evening, Buet had not received any word from the other 2 columns, thus he ordered Riviere's column to pull back to Hanoi. It turned out the other 2 columns had actually failed to apply enough pressure on the Black Flag line of defenses, allowing Leo Yong Fu to toss nearly the kitchen sink at Riviere's force, who were simply more isolated than the rest. Corone's central column had not even made contact with the enemy, while Bichot's column captured the village of Chem, and then became stuck when they ran into the second Black Flag defensive line. On the night of the 16th of August, Bichot's men advanced on a defensive line only to find out the Black Flag units abandoned it during the night, because while all of this was going on, the Red River had begun flooding on August the 15th. The Black Flag Army knew more so about the flooding situation in the area and had slowly pulled out. Bichot, meanwhile, was simply content with occupying their abandoned line and decided not to pursue the enemy, which was a huge mistake as the Black Flag Army was actually in quite some disarray from the flooding. The Battle of Phu Huai, as it became known, resulted in 17 deaths and 62 wounded for the French, and perhaps a few hundred deaths and many hundred wounded Black Flag units. Though the Black Flag Army took very heavy casualties, the fact that they had stopped the French advance had thus won them a victory. This led to local Tonkinese officials to be quite wary over what was going on in this conflict. Who exactly was winning? Now, the flooding forced the Black Flag Army to pull back behind the Dai River. They took up a new position around the villages of Pham, which lay on the road going to Santai, and the village of Palan, which lay at the junction of the Red and Dai Rivers. Buet resolved to attack the Black Flags again. So he took his French, Cochin Chinese, and Yellow Flag forces alongside 6 gunboats to hit the village of Palan. On August 31st, he began his offensive by using his gunboats to bombard the village, and he sent a French battalion to storm Palan village. The village was taken with ease as the Black Flag units fled along the dikes away. Then the next day, Buet's column marched towards Pham, along the 2-meter-wide dikes running along the bank of the Dai River. The column made it 3 kilometers from Palan, where they ran into 1,200 or so Black Flag units supported by over 3,000 Vietnamese. The Black Flag units were armed with many modern Winchester rifles, fighting tenaciously and giving little ground. The Vietnamese forces, meanwhile, were not making much of an active resistance, and instead they beat gongs, drums, and made war chants, perhaps sitting on the fence, as you might imagine. As the French column pressed forward, the Black Flags began to pull back to a central defensive line behind some earthworks and dikes. Leo Yong Fu had his HQ in a small pagoda, and around the central command were some hidden artillery positions very well camouflaged. As the French approached the earthworks and the dikes, the artillery began to fire, causing heavy casualties amongst the French. The French were unable to locate where all the fire was coming from, prompting Buet to order his gunboats to come closer and bombard the area. However, the gunboat shells were soaked by rain and many were failing to explode, causing very little damage. Eventually, Buet ordered an assault upon the enemy's center. The column marched into a flooded rice paddy field, wading up to their breasts in water and holding their rifles above their heads. The Black Flags from their concealed positions rained hell down upon them. Despite the carnage, the French pressed forward, forcing the defenders to give way from the intensive fire, and soon the Black Flag right wing collapsed towards its center. The French forces took advantage and began charging upon the enemy, causing a rout as the Black Flag army fled. The French had roughly 16 dead with almost 50 wounded, while the Black Flags left 60 dead on the battlefield and probably several hundred more dead and wounded were carried off. Buet's men tried to keep orderly conduct, but apparently the Yellow Flag units went around cutting off the heads of the corpses and plundering peaceful nearby Vietnamese villages, so Buet disbanded them. Leo Yong Fu retained his army despite the tactical victory for the French. Thus, from the viewpoint of his superiors, Buet had actually failed. Buet resigned in early September as a result, and he would be replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Anisse Edmond Justin Bichot, the next high-ranking officer in Tonkin. His tenure would be short-lived, however, and consisted of little more than reconnaissance actions. Though during these, his men found the remains of Henri Rivière, whose mutilated body had been buried near a village called Quien Mai. From that point on, France decided to give Admiral Corb command over the expeditionary forces. Corb would receive significant reinforcements in the form of over 10,000 men, led by General Charles Théodore Milhaud. Corb was instructed to uphold the primary mission to annihilate the Black Flag army of Leo Yong Fu. However, things were about to get a whole lot messier. The Black Flag army had fled to the fortified city of Santai, and the French had gradually figured out that they were being supported by the Ching Dynasty. The French had discovered that Ching had sent a large amount of troops over the border pretending to be Black Flag army units. French Foreign Minister Paul Armand Chalamal-Lacour had met with the Ching minister Zhang Jize in Paris multiple times in 1883. He attempted to get the Ching to withdraw their covert forces who were garrisoning cities like Bắc Ninh, Lạng Sơn, and Son Tay. The Ching refused and continuously made excuses. The French tried to speak to the German government to delay the recent sale of the battleships Tingyuan and Jinyuan to the Ching to pressure them, only to be met with anti-French protests within China. Riots and minor attacks began against the French-held concessions in Guangzhou. The French knew to attack the Black Flag Army further would most likely see a war break out with the Ching. France's military planners decided if they could launch a lightning storm campaign against the rest of Tonkin and seize it quickly enough, the Ching would likely back down. Thus, in December of 1883, Admiral Corb received authorization to launch a campaign against Leo Yong Fu and the Black Flag Army, knowing full well it would probably result in an undeclared war against the Ching Dynasty. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube, where I've just now finished up my multi-part series on China's warlord era. Also, this is just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast is on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The French kept allowing officers to stir up trouble in Vietnam, leading to the Tonkin Campaign. Now France was stuck in a war against the Nguyen Empire, the Black Flag Army of Leo Yong Fu, and soon the Ching Dynasty would join in on the fun.